I made the decision really early on, essentially when I started the podcast, that Neighbors Again was not going to be about chasing after headlines, because when you get in that game of you got to be the first one that has the story, you're wrong a lot. And I didn't want to be wrong a lot and have to go back and say, oops, I commented on something that didn't wind up being true. We live in a world where it's all about clicks and eyeballs and views and downloads. And if you play that game, then you wind up being wrong a lot and you wind up looking dumb a lot. Case in point this week. The worst thing I saw on Twitter. Breaking news, Hurricane Irma to make landfall. So the hurricane we've known about for several days is going to do what hurricanes do. That's news, huh? All right. Major events happening this week, from DACA to the violence at Berkeley over Ben Shapiro speaking there, to possible riots in St. Louis this weekend over another police officer who was on trial who was acquitted for shooting a suspect. I'm not going to say anything about any of that stuff until the facts sort themselves out. So we're just going to chill on all that stuff, although I think each one of those topics will most likely have a future episode. Today we talk about something everybody was talking about 4 months ago and has completely fallen off the radar, and that's the refugee situation. Griffin Jackson spent some time living in Lebanon serving refugees. He's a writer for Christianity Today, Chicago Tribune, and we've crossed paths a bit, both writing for Relevant magazine, so it was a great time to get him on, as this still matters. And we actually, for two people who share a very similar worldview and actually agree on the big points, we actually find a lot that we differ on here, but I think that makes it for a better conversation and hopefully something that makes you question just where you stand on things and helps you wrestle with a topic. Oh yeah, one other thing. Got a better microphone finally, but for the interview I forgot to put the little foam cover thing on it that keeps you from like popping your peas and breathing into it. So the audio finally has gotten better, but this episode could be worse, but after this it'll be better. All right, let's do it. My name's Seth Tower Hurd. Let's be neighbors again. Oh wait, I'm back one more time. So, new microphone apparently wasn't hooked up correctly, and this was recorded through the laptop speakers, so it kind of sounds like garbage, but it's a really important topic. And I swear this is the last time I will beg your forgiveness for audio issues, as I now have the setup I wanted and needed for a while, and I just screwed up today. But the content's still fantastic.
And if we can't walk in love, we're a noisy little gong, a bitter little song that a bully sings out of key. And if we can't walk in peace, we'll forget about the least of these. A mother crying on her knees for a boy who's locked away. There's a voice calling me.
All right, Griffin Jackson joins me today talking about the refugee stuff. And one of the reasons I love going in a different direction than the headlines are going right this minute, right? Like in the headlines, everybody's still talking about DACA and, possibly the events at Berkeley last week and, more, Antifa violence there. The reason I kind of like being a little bit behind the times is because the stuff that's not in the headlines is maybe even more important to talk about, because it's like, oh my gosh, the international mega crisis. And then everybody moves on. And it's like, well, that thing back there is still affecting millions and millions and millions of people. So we should probably talk about it. We're going to dig into the refugee crisis with Griffin Jackson today, who joins me, Chicago-based writer who has contributed to several magazines, including some like Relevant magazine that I also write for. So we cross paths there. So first of all, thanks for being cool. It's always weird. Like, writers are either the easiest, most generous people to hang out with, or they're super territorial and weird, and that always weirds me out, because it's like, dude,
No, it's totally true. I agree with you.
I mean, it's not like this isn't the NBA. It's not like only 64 people get drafted. you know what I mean? Like,
some.
every time I meet another writer who's cool, I just want to point that out because I definitely do have those experiences where it's like, why are you talking to me? You're trying to steal my stuff. Well, no, your work is out there in public. If I wanted to steal it, I would just copy it, and then you would catch me. Like, so let's get into the fact. Let's maybe start with the fact that you actually lived in Lebanon.
That's right. So, right after school, I studied international relations and development, thinking that I was going to work in policy in DC, but I actually went the other direction and got into journalism here in Chicago. But after a while, I kind of knew that, especially with the Arab Spring and the crisis in Syria, I knew I wanted to be involved directly with that instead of just writing and editing for it from the States. So, I left my job at the newspaper and I moved to Lebanon with an organization doing humanitarian aid work based out of Beirut. So working with lots of Syrian refugees, Palestinian refugees, and Iraqi refugees in Lebanon.
Okay.
For a year from the summer of 2015 to 2016.
And if we can get our heads around how many refugees there are in the world, I believe it's 70 million, correct?
That's right. That's about that number.
So to get there,
sorry, I should clarify. It's about 70 million displaced people. People, there's all this semantics about what is a refugee. Technically, under kind of UN definitions, there are only about 22 million refugees, but there's all kind of stateless people, like IDPs, internally displaced people, asylum seekers. So in total, I use the word refugee, but really we're talking about displaced people generally.
Yeah, okay. And so, for example, I make jokes about living in Wisconsin because I'm a Cook County taxes refugee. I'm not technically a refugee, even though I joke around about that.
Exactly, yes.
By the way, if you want me to bring you some contraband soda next time I'm in Chicago.
Please. Because
you guys just got it's 100% tax on soda, right?
Something like that, something crazy.
And there's all these billboards that say that, well, it's for the children. It's fighting childhood obesity to have the soda tax. It's like, well, obviously it's making a lot of money as well because you can afford billboards to tell us about how great it is that you're taxing us.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure they're doing it for the money. I think there are some good side effects. Hopefully kids will be healthy. That's not the reason they're doing it.
No, and that's the thing. It's like, just be honest about it, right? I mean, like in Chicago, and we're getting back on the refugee thing, but there were only supposed to be toll roads until they paid for the roads. And then the tolls continued. I mean, this was since the 1970s, right? And like, well, this is doing a lot of good. No, just say, hey, the toll roads are going to stay. We need the tax base. We have a lot of expenses. Just say that as opposed to, well, we're going to do a PR campaign. Nobody's going to like you anymore. It's not going to be popular. Stop spending money to make it popular. And if you really want to fight childhood obesity, a billboard is sometimes $6,000, $7,000 a month. That can fund a little nonprofit working against childhood obesity for a couple months. Go do that. Which obviously has to do with refugees. So that was worth throwing in here.
Almost the same. Almost, yeah.
Okay, so walk me through this. You get to Lebanon. By the way, what did your family and friends think about you taking off and going to a place where you might get your head cut off?
Yeah, no, I love that question. And that is one of the top questions that I got before and even like while being there and since then. I feel very fortunate that my family was really supportive. Certainly, I'm sure there were some nerves, just the way the media works or the image of the Middle East that we have here in the United States especially. It seems like a scary, dangerous place. And certainly there are places that I probably wouldn't go. But definitely Lebanon, by and large, is super safe, super beautiful. A lot of tourists. I would highly recommend it. Like anybody interested in going a cool place, go to Lebanon. So, people had questions like, why are you going there? But I think especially my family and friends were very sympathetic. In my family, my older brothers lived in the Middle East for the last on and off for the last 10 years. So they were used to it and really just trusting that this was the right decision.
Now, what did he go over for? Was it business? Was it for some sort of relief or Christian mission work, or what took him over there?
Nope. So he went initially as a student and then went back to work as a teacher.
Okay. So he just liked it, went for it.
Yeah. He just has loved living there, and now he and his wife live there, and they just really enjoy it. So they were just not citizens of Egypt, but they're just regular people there doing their thing.
I think we need to set the stage a little bit more before we talk about all these people moving around the Middle East. There's a perception that the Arab Peninsula is a lot like Afghanistan or Pakistan, and those things just cannot be further from each other. So in most of Afghanistan, most of Pakistan, people live in the mountains. They herd goats. They play this crazy game that's sort of like polo, only you drag a dead goat around, which I would play it if I was over there. Very rural, very tribal. People think that's what Iraq, Iran, Lebanon, Syria are like. And these are actually very urbanized areas.
Definitely.
That, and when they're not politically unstable, actually do great. Like if you look at pictures of Iran in the 1950s before, the overthrow, it's a beautiful place. Like I would want to live there. I think it looks super cool. It looks like, the kind of the golden age of like American cinema and classic cars, and everybody's dressed fancy and they're happy. And then of course, it's not totally like that today. But again, Iraq, very, very urbanized country. There's not a lot of people out in the countryside. Money has to come from somewhere other than natural resources. The United States actually, does great at having a lot of raw materials to work with. Other than oil, these countries don't have that. And so their money has to come from the fact that they create cities and create stuff, right? So where did you move? What was the economy based on? And how did you live? Like kind of what did you do for fun? How did you interact with your neighbors?
So I've traveled throughout a lot of the Middle East, and I would just echo what you said. I was in Syria in 2009. So this was before the conflict, but Syria, super beautiful place, super industrialized. Like that was an economic engine of the Middle East. And, I mean, a lot of these places aren't incredibly developed, but they're definitely comfortable metropolitan areas. It's not like people just living out in the fields. So I went straight to Beirut, Lebanon, because it's such a small country. Beirut's kind of right in the center on the coast, and you can get anywhere in Lebanon within a couple hours. It's very built up. So Beirut is a big city, maybe a couple million people, and not including refugees. There are a lot of refugees living there as well. But yeah, it's very, it has lots of industry, has big businesses. It has a growing tech sector. Has a huge port and airport. So really comfortable place. And Beirut is often, both historically and I would say even today, compared to almost like, they call it the Paris of the Middle East, or in some ways like the Amsterdam or the New York of the Middle East, because it is a really nice, comfortable city. And certainly there are places that feel very Middle Eastern in the way you would think of it, in the sense that pretty conservative, in terms of what's worn and the way people are behaving, but there are definitely parts of it that feel very European. Definitely there are lots of nightclubs, if that's what you're into, lots of amazing restaurants, lots of bars. It definitely is a place, again, like I said, I would highly recommend it even for tourists. It's a really great place to go.
And with the experience I've had with French people, I think I would love to go to a place like Paris, only without French people. So that was a great pitch.
Yeah.
My great uncle fought his way. I mean, my grandfather and great uncles were all drafted into World War II, but the one great uncle fought his way through France and into the Battle of the Bulge and into Germany. And so the anti-American sentiments that I've had from French people, it's like, okay, I get it. There are things that the United States has done that I'm not proud of either, but you'll notice what language you're speaking. Who do you have to thank for that? Good talk. All right, so it sounds like
I just add, speaking of language, Lebanon is also an awesome place because, especially in Beirut, almost everyone, especially like anyone under the age of 40, is going to speak English or French in addition. So it's super easy to get around. My Arabic's not that great, and I can get around no problem.
I do feel guilty for not knowing a language, and I actually, as many Hispanics as there are in the United States, if I was going to travel more internationally, French truly is the universal language. It's the universal business language. I wish I could speak it. Probably not enough to actually try. That's where my stated values, my actual values probably don't line up. But if you want to get around the world and be able to communicate with people, English and French are it. So that's very, very cool that it can come in like that. So it sounds like you had a pretty great time over there.
I loved it.
You take this really beautiful place and pretty crowded place. So the whole country, maybe to put it in perspective, is maybe a little bigger than like the extended Chicago area, maybe down to like Champaign, Illinois, maybe up to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, one of those. So like Chicago to Milwaukee would be roughly about the size of the country.
It's tiny. Yeah.
So small place, developed. All of a sudden, there's how many million extra people just kind of hanging out?
Yeah, so Lebanon has had kind of a rough go. They just got over their own pretty brutal civil war in the early 90s, and they have been recovering since then. But they've had hundreds of thousands, upward of 500,000 Palestinian refugees who have been living in Lebanon since the creation of the State of Israel, or recently, or just a little bit after that. So they have been there and been considered stateless people or refugees for the last 60 or 70 years.
And so why has Lebanon not naturalized them or done something with them then?
So yeah, that's a good question. Most Palestinians living in Lebanon or in Jordan or anywhere else in the Middle East, like they have a goal, they have a mission to return to Palestine. They have a mission to return to their homeland. So certainly they want to be accepted and naturalized in the sense of being part of the community in Lebanon, but they're not interested in becoming Lebanese citizens for the sake of that. On the other hand, Lebanon doesn't want to. There is an element of discrimination, absolutely. Palestinians are despite the popularity of the cause of Palestine, Palestinians themselves are not treated particularly well, not seen in a very favorable light, even by many Arabs or Lebanese people. So, yeah, I don't think the Lebanese government is interested in welcoming 500,000 Palestinians into, as just regular citizens. Because their population of Lebanese people is only 4 million people. So to bring in that many new people, welcome them into your jobs, welcome them into your communities, that's tough. So almost all Palestinians in Lebanon live in camps, which is also why now with the Syrian crisis, Lebanon did not create any refugee camps for Syrians because they didn't want a repeat of what happened with the Palestinians who stayed. So all Syrian refugees, they don't live in camps. They live in kind of makeshift shelters or else in the cities.
And what do they do all day? I'm assuming they're not employable. They don't have papers.
The Palestinians or the Syrians?
The Syrians. I'm assuming. I mean, they have no real inroads to society, right?
It's definitely is pretty tough for them. I give the Lebanese government. The Lebanese government is not particularly functional. However, I give them some credit for this is a population of 4 million Lebanese people, and they have between 1.5 and 2 million refugees in their country. That means maybe a third, probably at least a third of people living in Lebanon are refugees. And the fact that they have tolerated that and been able to survive for the last 7 years is pretty amazing in itself. So all Syrians are entitled to go to school in Lebanon for free. And certainly getting jobs is tough, but it is permissible for Syrian refugees to find work if they're able, or to have their own businesses. So there are definitely restrictions and definitely a lot of hardships, and a lot of Syrians are not employed or are very underemployed or exploited. But definitely some Syrians, they do have ways of being involved in society, but they're kind of second class.
Okay. Syria, a very developed nation as well. We're talking about at least a decent number of doctors, engineers, white-collar workers. These aren't, people who just go out and shovel rocks all day, right? Like they came in with a skill set. And are those the people who are pretty underemployed then?
So, it's all kinds. At the beginning of the Syrian crisis, it was a lot of, I would say, poorer, more vulnerable Syrians who were becoming refugees, going to Turkey, going to Jordan, going to Lebanon, because they had no other options, because they didn't have any money to sustain themselves. And also those were the areas that were first targeted by, the resistance as well as the Syrian army. But then once the conflict progressed, especially targeting Aleppo was the economic engine and the economic heart of Syria. And so when Aleppo really got crazy, that's when a lot of the what we might call more professional, the people with higher degrees, more educated folks, they became refugees as well. And so they fled. Definitely most Syrian, people who were doctors and lawyers in Syria aren't doctors and lawyers now in Lebanon. Most of them are working pretty menial jobs, maybe in the food industry, in the fields.
And it's because they're not allowed to practice their profession legally,
Yeah,
or
exactly.
they don't
They're
have
not
the
licensed
income
in
to start it
Lebanon.
up.
Yeah, and also there's just not a need for, Lebanon already has a huge amount of doctors and lawyers themselves, and there's just not a need for Syrian doctors and lawyers, especially who are refugees and super vulnerable.
Okay. Actually, long term, I'm assuming we are going to get single health payer healthcare, which tends to lead to lower rates of people wanting to go into the medical industry. We may wind up needing to import a whole bunch of those people, so we may change our mind on on immigrants real quick when we don't have any doctors. That's a different show, a different episode. Yeah. So what brought you back then, and what were you doing over there?
Yeah, so when I was there, like I said, I was with an organization, a humanitarian aid organization doing relief and development work. So I was in the field. The way I describe it, I was in the field kind of at schools, in hospitals, at delivery centers or service centers, maybe 30 or 40% of the time. And then most of the rest of the time I was doing what is called monitoring and evaluation. And that is kind of, we need to propose projects. We need to get funding from donors and say, okay, we're going to deliver this much food, or we're going to give psychological care for this many people. So proposing projects, doing a lot of research and interviewing people on the ground to find out what the needs are, and then proposing those projects to win money in order to implement them. So that's
okay, so functionally it was journalism in order to raise money.
I don't know if I call it journalism. It's a little more technical than that, but I was doing a lot of writing and research and talking to people to raise money, like writing very in detail the nature of the projects we're going to do. How are we going to measure if they're successful? How are we going to implement them well?
Okay, tell me about coming back then.
Yeah,
what kind of reactions did you receive? Were you surprised at the tone of the United States when you got back here?
Yeah, so, certainly it's not like I was in a bubble. I was pretty aware of all the election stuff going on. Trump and Clinton were super popular topics, even among Lebanese people. So very aware of what was happening back in the States. But my contract with the organization was only a year. So I intended to be there for a year and then kind of reassess. So I came back last August. And yeah, this was kind of after the primaries. This was getting into the height of the election. And, naturally the issue of refugees, the issue of terror, the issue of immigration, those were super hot topics and still continue to be. So I wouldn't say that I was surprised at what was being talked about. I think I was surprised at the sort of fury and aggressiveness on both sides, with which it was being talked about, as though these weren't people. It was statistics. It was fear. It was a lot of I don't know. It wasn't being talked about in a super rational way, in my mind, having been there on the ground. And I am totally sympathetic that before I went to Lebanon and did this, it's not like I was super aware of what it was actually like to work with refugees. And so that's the situation for 99% of Americans. But yeah, most people we don't have a great idea of what the needs are, of who these people are, of how to address those needs.
Okay. Let me spit some ideas at you, because I think I definitely take a middle road here. A little bit of background, if you're listening, and I've mentioned this several times, but Griffin, for you, part of my extended family are, who married in are refugees from Laos. And so I have all these half Laotian cousins, and we call them the redneck Asian crew because they all watch NASCAR, drink Keystone Light, drive F-150s. Yes. So obviously I'm very sympathetic to this cause, because I've seen these people come in, start businesses, do very well financially, give back a lot. I'm a really big fan of that, and they're my family members. I grew up so much richer because I had these experiences, right? I mean, I could eat with chopsticks when I was 4, right? I'm not typical farm kid upbringing. On the flip side, I would say that there's a middle ground between just turning people loose and doing nothing. And so you have one side that says, oh, we should do nothing, and another side that says you are welcome here. The bottom line is that Islam is different than other religions, and that Islam does sanction you to throw gay people off of buildings. Islam does follow a guy who killed 700 people in one campaign, without a doubt. That doesn't mean that most Muslims are bad, but we do have to take that into account. My view on it is that, first of all, there are huge swaths of land that we do nothing with in the Western United States. I actually think if we made those refugee colonies, they would figure out ways to make money and would build things there. And I think would be a huge net gain for the United States. We can't ignore the violence that a lot of the refugees did bring upon Sweden and Germany. And so my middle road would be that we would take in as many people as we could. We would put them behind fences, and they might live there for 3 or 4 or 5 years till we could vet people. And then we could either help them get set up where, either they're willing to basically go into mainstream American culture, and we help them move to wherever. I'd put them in like Detroit or Cleveland, or an area that's economically depressed, because they're going to make money and they're going to help us turn it around. Or they don't want that, and we put them out in Idaho where there's nothing and build them a little town, and odds are they're going to improve the economy. But if they sit behind a fence for 3 or 4 years while we vet them, there are very real terrorists that want to kill a lot of people. And I just think that's the price you got to pay to be able to do this right. And so when I say something like that, both sides hate me, because one side says they're all rapists and terrorists and murderers, and the other side says you have no heart, you don't know what you're talking about, everybody's super nice in the whole world, except for Republicans. Those people are bad. But other than that, they're the real terrorists. But other than that, everybody's very nice, and you're not being nice. I would say I'm being realistic. What's your take on that?
Yeah, a lot there. Maybe just a couple of points where I would jump in. I agree with you on the idea that, yeah, there's a middle ground. I absolutely think there's a need for security. Like, this is a nation of laws, and we want to keep people safe. Absolutely. I 100% agree. I also believe, for a number of reasons, just as a human and for my own faith, I would say there is a need and an obligation and an opportunity to welcome people. So I agree with you that we need to find a middle way. I guess some of the only things I would say, or I like what you say about even in your own family, the contribution of refugees. I think that's something that is often overlooked in the whole conversation. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of like, how are we going to support these people? They're taking jobs or they're costing money. Yeah, there's some of that, especially upfront costs. But in the long run, despite what the popular narrative is, like, economists largely agree that an influx of refugees or immigrants of any kind, like in the long term, maybe over 10 or 20 years, is actually super powerful for the economy, because in general, they have a strong work ethic. They want to prove themselves in their country, and like, they're thinking outside the box. They're bringing new ideas. They start new businesses. So absolutely, I think the contribution of refugees is a huge part of it. And then in terms of violence, I mean, yeah, I'm not going to minimize. I'm not going to say that no refugee has ever been violent. But just the bottom line is that of like 3.3 million refugees settled in the U.S. since 1975, like a minuscule number of them, I think 40 or less, have been accused or have been convicted on crimes of terror. Just the idea of being killed by a refugee is next to nothing. And Europe, I think, absolutely, there has been violence at the hands of refugees in Europe, Sweden, Germany, these places. I think that that's an unfair comparison only because Europe is a different place simply geographically. Literally, refugees from Syria, Afghanistan, Northern Africa are taking boats and walking into Europe unvetted. The United States, that can't happen. Every single refugee who comes to the United States is like chosen, is selected over a multi-year vetting process. So yeah, we need to be careful in our vetting, absolutely, but I don't think that we need to worry about, we don't know who these people are, they're at risk, that they're suspect of like committing terrorist acts in the country. It's just not the same situation.
I guess where I actually maybe am more compassionate than our current system is I would take a bunch of people in, and if we had to, and that's where I would put them behind fences so that they were fed and safe while we were vetting them for a few years, because we're going to save a lot more lives that way. And for the people who are, concerned that, well, they're not paying taxes, they're not contributing, Mitt Romney was not wrong. That statistic is right. 47% of people do not contribute to the tax base at all. So having a few more of those, let's go. I mean, I would love to start deporting people who have defrauded the disability system for 15 years. I would send all of those people to Syria, tell them good luck, and bring in a bunch of refugees. I really would. I mean, if you've stolen from the government for over a decade and you don't feel bad about it and you don't want to work, I would replace you with someone who wants a job and is super grateful and actually will wind up loving America in their own way. Because if you loved America, you would contribute and not smoke weed and watch cable TV all day. And by the way, that's not that's not targeting any particular race or anything. I'm actually thinking about a white person I know in Kenosha. That is, I'm speaking about that person who got drunk, wrecked his stupid motorcycle, and has never gotten a job again because he laid his Harley down on the highway because he was hammered. And he's never had to because we just let him make enough money to keep smoking weed and watch cable TV.
Yeah. So with that, I think that the argument, it is a common argument, sort of the welfare state argument is also applied to refugees in the sense that a lot of people who are on welfare in the United States are accused of abusing that system and never pursuing like vocation. And that argument, that line of thinking is often applied to refugees. If we resettle a bunch of refugees, aren't we just enabling them? And, I would probably say the same thing to both of those positions, just that, yeah, like there's definitely a need for accountability, and we don't want to create total dependency, but especially for refugees, like we can provide some relief in the short term. Like, let's just help them out, get them safe, get them food, get them what they need. And then in the long term, like develop their skills. We're not trying to create a population of welfare refugees. We're trying to enable people to plant their roots in this country or in any country so that they can eventually provide for themselves. So like I said earlier, up front, there are going to be costs, but in the long term, they way more than pay for themselves.
Well, and this is something I've dealt with on other episodes. Forgive me for repeating myself if you heard this before, but Wisconsin is at a 3% unemployment rate. I mean, that's insane. This is the best time in our lifetimes economically, right? One of my friends who's in cold storage, warehouse that ships in and ships out frozen food, right? They're at a point where they can't grow anymore because people won't do that job. People will do that job? People who weren't born here. That's pretty much it. And this whole thing of like, oh, we're stealing American jobs. Well, Americans should go do the dang jobs that are open. And then we can talk about, and then if those are all full, we can talk about stealing jobs. But the bottom line is, and again, I've said this and people have gotten upset about it, but I don't care. I am a 1%er in America. From the 1% of Americans who grew up on working farms. And I can still physically go do a day's work. Most Americans cannot. I mean, my wife was talking to somebody the other day. It's like, hey, you want to hang out? No, I had to work 50 hours this week. Nobody on a farm has ever worked 50 hours. Nobody's ever gotten that low, ever in the history of farming. 50 hours. I'm like, oh, man, I got some time to play some Xbox here. So this idea that we're, and it does go back to the election somewhat, too, that we're stealing jobs from Americans. Well, Americans have had years to go do those jobs, and they don't. I didn't give you much to respond to there.
No. I mean, I would pretty much agree with you. Yeah, I think that I don't look at it as refugees or immigrants stealing American jobs or replacing Americans. It's moving into the displacement, moving into empty positions or needed positions. And even in Lebanon, the issue is definitely not, finding work there is work to be done and there are people willing to do it. The real issue is like, okay, we need to make sure we're not exploiting these people. The issue is more with the people who are employing them to make sure that the conditions are good, like that we're treating them the way they should be treated. And so I'm not saying that's necessarily the case in the US, but I'm not particularly worried about there being enough work or people willing to do it. I think that's there. It's more, we just need to present them with the opportunities that are befitting of their skills and their ambitions.
Yeah. So, and I would say too, for people who want no refugees in the United States at all, none. A refugee is 8 times more likely to start a business and hire people than you are. So if you don't want them here, you better go start a business yourself, and you'd better hire multiple employees in the next 10 years, or you're a freaking hypocrite. Like, either put your life savings down, open a business, and hire other people and grow the economy, because you working for somebody else is great, It may provide you a comfortable lifestyle, but it doesn't necessarily grow anything. I mean, yes, you have money to spend on things, and that's good, but that's not what grows the economy. What grows the economy is new products, new services, new ideas. If you're never going to start one of those things, then shut up. Like, I have no interest in talking to you about this topic.
I worked when I came back from Lebanon. I worked for just a few months with World Relief, which is an organization doing a lot of resettlement work and then legal work with refugees and immigrants. And yeah, so I met a lot of I went to the airport and literally took refugees from the airport to their new homes. And when we do that, a lot of times we will take people who came to the United States as refugees maybe 10 or 20 years ago, and they will kind of be like, oh, here's an introduction. Welcome to the U.S. Here's someone from your own country. And I was so amazed and impressed. The people that went along with us, the people who were welcoming new refugees, they came 10 or 20 years ago as refugees with nothing. And now, like, the vast majority of them are super, in successful businesses, have started their own companies, employ people, just part of the fabric of the United States. And I think that's just a testament to, okay, these people, they came 20 years ago, they're helping new people come and hopefully repeat that cycle. Well,
when you mentioned that, we need to make sure we're not exploiting these people, I wanted them to not be exploited as well. But the bottom line is, even if they are, they're probably going to do something amazing anyway. My fake Asian grandpa, like my half Asian cousin's grandpa that I, grew up with and still love dearly, right? I mean, he's still somebody I love hanging out with when I can. He had a PhD from France. And he had to come over here because, their country was at war. Their economy was tanked out from socialism. And he had to start over. Started over cleaning Sears third shift. You know what? He's good. He completely rebuilt a life. His kids are all really successful. So even if you wind up exploiting, some of these people wind up getting exploited, you're not going to keep them down. You're just not.
Exactly. Most of the people, so through World Relief, they also help refugees find employment. It's a difficult process, but they do it. And yeah, definitely almost all of them start in, third shift food service or in hotels or in cleaning companies or in the jobs that are not typically desirable for Americans who have lived here their whole lives. And so they are willing to do it. And yeah, they're not great jobs, but these people have so much drive to get out of, to improve their lives, especially for themselves and for their children, that they're going to make it work.
And I think that there's a connection to American poverty here that we can talk about. And that is that somehow refugees are not afflicted with kind of the American poverty mindset of saying, you can't get out of this. I think that is the number one thing. We talk about education in poor areas and that type of thing. The number one thing is that people don't know how to get themselves out. They don't know how to build something. And the thing is somehow refugees figure that out. They've come from another place. They have another skill set. If you take somebody that had left abject poverty like Jay-Z or Ben Carson or whoever, right, that just grew up just in a terrible situation, Jeff Bezos from Amazon, right, all grew up on welfare, grew up on public aid, grew up, hungry sometimes. So those guys are ranging in age from probably 45 to 60, right? If you stripped everything from all three of those guys, Damon John from Fubu, from Shark Tank, early 40s, if you took every dime they had and you threw them into abject poverty again and just gave them very basic, standard of living, here's some ramen noodles, do you really think it would take any of them more than 5 years to be a millionaire again? Starting with nothing, no resources, nothing but the brain in the head and in the will in their heart. I'm guessing all five of them would amass $1 million within 5 years because they have knowledge. That's the true poverty. And poverty is horrible, right? Poverty is horrible. But just as bad as the actual physical effects of poverty and the shame of poverty is the mindset that everybody around you tells you can't get out of it because it keeps it going. And when we bring these people in who are poor from another place and they do it, that is the American dream. And I think there's a net positive that shows us all we can do it.
To that, I think I would largely agree. I mean, I don't know. I like those hypotheticals. I think absolutely. I imagine you would agree. There are some systemic forces and there is such a thing as like real oppression. But I also think that, I mean, speaking again as a
Yeah.
white person, I can say this more easily, but there are avenues to overcome that, and I hope and I believe. And so definitely there are real material forces keeping people down, but I agree that those people and a lot of refugees prove it every day that it is possible. Like there are ways of building up a life and building up a life for your children.
Well, and my dad took off when I was 18. I wound up getting 3 jobs while I was attending junior college on a full scholarship to help my mom out. Right, I would work at the mall in the evenings. I'd break up concrete during the day, and then I actually got started in radio midnight to 6 a.m. on a station in Iowa that would take me on the weekends. Right, so I did that for a year, and just kind of scraped together enough for fast food and gas between gigs. Right, like it was not a fun year. It was a really important year. And there certainly are obstacles that I would have encountered if I wasn't white. Like if you look at the number of Black high school kids who want a job in Chicago and don't have public transportation access or the ability to even get a minimum wage job because the jobs are so far out of the terrible neighborhood they live in, that's totally something that we have to deal with as a society. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Anybody that's looking to better themselves, we need to be helping. But there also is that thing where people believe that they're beat before they ever get started. And that's the worst thing that we could ever do to anybody.
Sure.
Like, if you're hearing in 2nd and 3rd grade, like, I don't care if it's your parents, your teachers, whoever it is, social worker, whoever, oh, well, this is just the way things are. You're just, you're never going to get out of here. You're never going to get out of Inglewood. Well, you're probably never going to get out of Inglewood if you've had that ingrained in you since you were 7 years old. And you just don't bring that to our society.
Yeah, we can't go into it with that mindset for refugees or for anyone in poverty or any vulnerable person in the United States or anywhere. So definitely mindset is a big part of it. We can't ignore the real world, the real world obstacles, but mindset, education, accessibility, these are big parts of it.
Okay, one more question, and let's talk about how to help these people, okay? So obviously, you lived around a lot of Muslims.
Sure, yes, I did.
Okay, and again, I mean, when my brother was dying of cancer, he had a female Muslim doctor who was one of the most important people I've ever crossed paths with, without a doubt. I've also read the Quran, and it definitely is a violent book. It becomes less violent as you go along, but I read the whole thing in study hall in high school because I was a weird kid. 99% of all terrorism globally is at the hands of people who would claim Islam. And that doesn't mean, we're talking about 1% of people of this faith probably who commit terrorist acts. But again, I mean, it's not Swedish grandmothers. It's not Hasidic Jews. It's not Buddhists. Bombings and stabbings and driving cars into people are all coming from one group of people. So how did you reconcile that, or how did you wrap your head around that, when you were there, that at least some of these people do want to kill Americans? And did you come across that anti-American sentiment?
Yeah. So interesting. Maybe first of all, I would only just kind of caution that, I mean, I agree with you. I think it is just the reality that a lot of what we see as terror is at the hands of Muslim extremists. Yeah, I think that's probably true.
Well, I mean, what would you define terror as?
Well, that's the thing. I would just
into buildings, driving trucks into people, blowing things up. Those are all terrorist acts, right? Like, I mean.
Yeah, no, but I think I would just make or I'm not sure why the distinction. I think I don't think Muslims are more violent. Like I think Christians and atheists and Hindus and Buddhists do lots of violence, like throughout the world. We might not see it as terror in the same way, but I'm not sure I would say that more violence is done by Muslims. Maybe more terror in the kind of in the definition we're using for terror.
Well, statistically, violence for the sake of religious advancement, and actually, if you go to the India-Pakistan conflict, there's a lot of terrorism done at the hands of Hindus against Muslims.
Yeah, so, exactly.
But in the United States, we have had racial violence, but that's communists fighting white supremacists.
Sure.
And we have had a few incidences, horribly, of 3 or 4 incidences this year of a white supremacist killing a Hindu Indian because they think they're a Muslim We had that shooting in Wisconsin, again, at the hands of an idiot who thinks that Sikhs are Muslims, and that is a completely different belief system, right? However, statistically, I'm not wrong here. People who blow up buildings and drive trucks into people and shoot up gay nightclubs, statistically, the vast overwhelming number of them come from this same ideology. Again, you do have the Oklahoma City bombing and there's other stuff, but you are in a city of millions of people. So how many of those people wished Americans would die? And let me just follow that up with saying too, Toronto is super anti-American, and secretly some of those people probably wish the Americans would die. From the last time I was up there, I don't get what they were so angry about. I was there during the Clinton years. What could you possibly have had so much rage about? Okay, so I'll let you talk here.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I won't go too far down that path, but I would just say, like, yeah, there's violence among all kind of people, all kind of belief systems. Yes, the violence is associated in the common perception and in reality with some strands of Islam. That's true. In my experience, having lived around, in a majority Muslim culture for that year and at other points in my life, it just wasn't a big thing for me. I think people are people. By the vast majority of people who were Muslims, like absolutely awesome people, wonderful people just like me who wanted to support their families. This is the cliche and very much the typical line about it, but I think that that's generally true. Most of these people are awesome and totally innocent, normal people. One personal experience which was very fascinating for me, early on in my time, so this must have been in fall of 2015, I went to an area, kind of a Hezbollah-controlled neighborhood. Hezbollah is this militant faction of Shia Muslims associated with Iran that, is kind of a militant group, but also very socially active and has a lot of hospitals and schools, that kind of group.
And for people who don't know, could you just recap the Shia and Sunni branches of Islam? Sorry,
yeah. So Islam, like Christianity, has a lot of different kind of sects, a lot of different denominations. And the two kind of overarching branches of Islam are Sunni Islam, which is about 90% of Muslims. Most of the countries you would think of, Egypt, the Gulf states, Turkey, are Sunni Muslim. And then there's also a branch called Shia Islam, which is about 10%. Iran is sort of the head or the focal point of Shia Islam. There are a few theological differences, but this goes all the way back to a very early schism in Islam. So yeah, there's a difference there, and most of the time they live together perfectly peacefully, but there is some, there's some animosity, or there can be, between Shia and Sunni, especially because they're both very large power blocks in the Middle East. But yeah, so I went to a mosque in a Hezbollah-controlled area. We were invited for something called Ashura, which is a Shia festival, or like an event, celebration. And so we were sitting in the mosque, and it was sort of one of those intimidating, out of a movie situations. I wouldn't have gone in and expected to be nervous. I was almost never nervous at all when I was in Lebanon. But this is a time where I felt a little bit uncomfortable. A lot of men dressed all in black in the mosque, and the sheikh was the preacher was speaking in this sort of the way we think of it, again, in sort of the propaganda, this sort of what sounded angry, what sounded aggressive tone. And at that point my Arabic was next to nothing, but I could clearly hear words like Israel and America, and it just sounded angry. And I found out afterward that sure enough, he was saying, he was sort of condemning the United States, condemning France, condemning a variety of countries, and speaking against them. And I'm just literally, me and a bunch of other, like several other students and aid workers are sitting up in the front, like literally in the front of the mosque, looking out at this crowd, who are all looking right at us as the preacher, says pretty strong, what clearly is pretty strong, aggressive rhetoric about my country. And I was really nervous. I was like, okay, I'm uncomfortable. How am I going to get out of here? So that was a kind of a frightening experience. And I was like, just waiting to run out of there as fast as I could. But when it ended, bizarrely, all these people who had been, what I thought, like staring daggers at me throughout this whole, what we might call a sermon, came up to me and were like, hey, like in English, they're like, hi, welcome to our country. Like, hey, you should come join me for tea. Like they had just heard all this rhetoric, anti-American, anti-Western rhetoric. And then immediately after come up and like shake my hand and give me gifts. And it just taught me, you know, certainly the anti-American sentiment is a real thing and does exist, but also it's such a cultural thing. Like it's just part of the rhetoric where it's not like a deeply held value by a lot of these people. What they were listening to and what the sheikh was saying, it was part of a narrative that definitely some people adhere to, but a lot of these people, like this is just part of the story. And then they come up and like give me a hug right afterward and ask me over. It was a very bizarre and sort of eye-opening experience. What seemed like cognitive dissonance between what is preached, what is heard on the media, or what is heard in the news or from the pulpit, and then the way regular Muslims actually live.
Okay. And that was Shia. So that was the much more, what we would say, much more hardline, not liberal, because Sunni Muslims like totally drink.
Yeah. I mean, on both sides, there are sort of what you would call liberal and conservative Shia and Sunni Muslims. Because this was in a Hezbollah-controlled neighborhood and it was during this festival, these were pretty serious, committed Shia Muslims, I imagine.
Okay. So there's your stated beliefs and then there's what you actually do. So, I mean, I guess that guy didn't practice what he preached because it was obviously you were American, or it was obviously you were Westerners, right? Non-Arabs.
We were their guests. They like invited us.
And did they want you to hear that, or they just wanted you to participate in their celebration? I
mean, I think, yeah, they wanted us to be part of the celebration. Again, it was like a ceremony remembering I think actually the death of a couple like figureheads in Shia Islam. So it wasn't like a happy celebration. They were flagellating and hitting themselves, which also added to the discomfort I felt. But yeah, really, I think they wanted us to be there. They wanted us to be part of the community, and the rhetoric that was coming from the pulpit, as I understood it and heard it to be after, no, I wouldn't say that it matched the sentiment expressed to me by just the regular people who came up to me like 2 minutes later.
Okay. And then I want to move on to how we can help. But we would both agree that people who blow up buildings, that idea comes from somewhere. And hearing sermons like that probably can't help.
I would agree. I would agree that definitely that rhetoric, whether people mean it in their hearts or not, like the rhetoric is not helpful if that's what they were really saying.
Well, Dylan Roof, the shooter in South Carolina who murdered 9 African Americans at church, he didn't just self-invent that when he was 18 and go kill a bunch of people when he was 19. I'm sure he grew up hearing a lot of horrible racist things. And while those people who raised him may not be guilty of murder, they certainly contributed to a mass killing. And so I would put that in the same category. And by the way, Kurds and Sunni Muslims in particular, I would have, no problem with them being my literal, neighbors across the road. A Shia Muslim moving into the apartment next door, my wife is half Jewish. I mean, that would give me a little more pause for concern. And this is not the majority of Muslims. I don't think there's hardly any Shia Muslims in the United States, but I also don't think I'm crazy for being mildly concerned if that were to happen.
Yeah, I would say that I don't think like the distinction between Shia and Sunni, there's theological distinctions and maybe like a perception. Obviously, the United States, for better or worse, is allied with the Sunni bloc, is allied with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, and sort of enemies or rivals with Iran, which is Shia. But I mean, I would say that Sunnis have, as like the Islamic State, ISIS is Sunni, and a lot of the Al-Qaeda is Sunni. They're not Shia. So definitely there are lots of Shia militant groups, but there are plenty of Sunni militant groups as well. So I wouldn't judge whether it's a Sunni or a Shia person. I would just be concerned. Like the only question I would have is, what is their ideology?
Yeah. Well, and as I've said before, I'm going to get some, Muslim clerics on the show. It's just been a little bit difficult to like find people and book them because, believe it or not, people are somewhat concerned about coming on a show where we're trying to find common ground here. And, the common ground, even though we've had some disagreements, is that my desire really is to bring people in and help them. And whether or not you agree with that, let's transition into some stuff that you can do.
Yeah.
Because we can't control the number of refugees the United States admits. There's nothing that we're going to do that will influence that policy between, let's say, now and November, right? Like, you and I can't do that. So what can we do?
So the way I think of it, I think there are kind of three strands which like overarching society should use to approach like assisting refugees. And that is through humanitarian aid work, which I typically associate with work abroad in these areas that are in conflict or disaster areas, resettlement, which is bringing them to us, and then just tackling the root issues. And so just some practical things that everyday people can do. Certainly, I would say if you're a person of faith, like pray about it. That's number one. But like typical things, give money to an NGO, or not just money, give food, give blankets, give canned goods, give just supplies. And I think a huge thing is actually to send people. If you're in a church, send your leaders in the church. If you are in a business, like send an influencer, send a change maker to Lebanon or to, Kenya or to Bangladesh, so that they can see it. Because these people who are going to make the decisions, if they see it on the ground, I think they're going to be much more likely to respond to it. That's one thing. Resettlement, again, it's fairly obvious. Visit a refugee family. If you're in a city, there are refugee families around you. Like, it's not that difficult. Encourage the local resettlement office. Having worked at World Relief, that is a burnout job, and people need like inspiration. They want you to bring in cookies. They want you to bring in cards. Just like support the people who are doing that difficult work. Tutoring refugees is a big one. Education is a huge motivator and a huge factor in the success of refugees. So, be a tutor. And then finally, in terms of root issues, I would say we probably can't change the number of refugees that the U.S. is going to let in, like you and I, but I think it is super valuable. Like signing petitions and calling your senator, I think it matters. Building up interfaith bridges, get the leader of the mosque and get the leader of the synagogue and the church together just to, have a dinner or something. And then support the presence of NGOs and religious organizations in the field doing this work, anti-militarization, support peace work, support development, support relief, however you can.
Okay. Let me ask you one more state of the Middle East question with a long lead up. Okay. So one of the biggest issues is that when Europeans shove people together who don't want to be countries, we wind up with very long wars. Congo is 8 individual African tribes who never wanted to be a country. But I believe that was the Dutch pulled out of there and shoved them together and said, hey, be a country, you're free now. That didn't work out. Right? Same thing with Pakistan, Afghanistan. A lot of times we're putting tribes together that don't want to hang out. The same thing with parts of Western Africa that don't want to hang out. As much as people would like to blame U.S. foreign policy for the state of the Middle East, it really goes back to post-World War I. Britain and France carved up the Middle East, including giving, and I forget their names, but 2 brothers countries because they promised each one of them a country if they would go to war against Turkey, against the Ottoman Empire. Modern day, I believe Syria and Jordan, I think, are the 2 that came out of that post-World War I, right? So we have a very complex issue where, Christians, Jews, Greek Orthodox, Yazidis, Catholics, Sunni, Shia, Kurds all got along pretty well until 1920, and then we shoved them all together, and once they had to be countries, it created a lot more issues. I don't know where I stand on what the ideal is, because we always want to say democracy, right? However, it does seem like there's a lower rate of human rights violations under secular dictatorships. And I really hate saying that. I really hate saying, yay, secular dictatorship. But compared to the chaos of removing those secular dictators, it seems like the chaos that follows, gives us ISIS, gives us what's going on in North Africa. Like, where do you land on that?
Yeah, it's super complicated issue. I was living in Egypt just for a semester in 2009. This was just prior to the Arab Spring, which began in Egypt. And a lot of my Egyptian friends were very supportive. Like, we're going for democracy. We want a democratic Egypt. The Arab Spring happened, and it hasn't really turned out the way that most of them intended. And now when I talk to them, a lot of them, or some of them, will say very, very cynically, and it makes me sad. They say, like, democracy, like, it just can't work here. And my Syrian friends say the same thing, like, democracy can't work here. We need a strong man. So on the one hand, definitely there are a lot of Arabs and Lebanese people who want and believe in democracy, but there are a rising number, even among the youth, who think that it cannot happen in the Middle East. I am a proponent. I think democracy probably is not the ideal, but is better than dictatorship. And I just think it's a long road. I think you need education, you need you need jobs. And like you say, there is a lot of just history, geography, religion, politics between ethnic groups and religious groups in the Middle East that makes that difficult. So whether it means splitting this up into, like, if the Kurds get their own state, if Assyrian Christians get their own state, if Shia Muslims in Syria get their own state, that doesn't sound like a great answer, but I think there are ways to produce peace and hopefully lead down a road that is away from dictatorship, but I think it takes a long time.
Well, and I don't want anybody to think that I'm coming off saying, well, white people, smart, invented democracy, Arab people, too dumb to carry out democracy. That's not it at all. I think that the human heart yearns for freedom, right? Unfortunately, there are a lot of geopolitical factors that the great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents of the current residents of a lot of these nations did not choose, that threw things into chaos after World War I. And to ignore those and think that they're just going to go away because democracy is great, is pretty tough. I think that there are just as many educated, intelligent, forward-thinking potential leaders in Iraq right now as there were at the founding of the United States. The difference being that the people at the founding of the United States just had to deal with kind of two things, right? They had to deal with people who were loyal to the crown, and really they didn't have to deal with them for that long because most of them went to Canada. That's actually how Canada got a huge population boom, is the loyalists actually went and rejoined the British Empire, right? And so we still had a very long road. The first form of democracy, the Articles of Confederation, failed. It's not that I think that people in Iraq are any less dumb. I think they've probably got an Alexander Hamilton and a Thomas Jefferson floating around out there who are brilliant. It's that there are so many more roadblocks for them to achieve peace and prosperity. And that's what's tough. I'm certainly not going to claim to be smart enough to talk about how to iron out some of those things, especially when I've never been there.
And I agree that there are a lot of obstacles that are being dealt with in the Middle East that are incredibly difficult to overcome. I would just kind of end it on an encouraging note and just say that there are a lot of, when I was there, I saw so many amazing people who are doing really incredible work in really difficult circumstances. Lebanon, when a third of your population is refugees, there are so many people who are giving their time, giving their money, giving their lives for the sake of peace and for the sake of helping their neighbors. It's going to be a long road, and it is a really difficult and sad situation, but also there are reasons to hope. And I did find a lot of encouragement just in the people that I met doing incredible work. Yeah.
Well, I would say that the average Lebanese person, this is somewhat based on anecdotal data, right? But if you look at the most selfless time in America, it was post 9/11. It's easy to even be nostalgic for that world. As horrible as it was and as scary as it was, it brought out what Abraham Lincoln would call the better angels of our nature, right? Yeah. And, the better things go and the less we are from an existential threat, the more we become selfish and isolated and me first again. Yeah. The Lebanese are in a country where that's just not possible. And so I would say that there's probably a far greater percentage of people who are selfless, creative problem solvers giving back than there are in the United States, because people in the United States just get lazy and watch more Netflix. As things go better. So if I can end it on that, some people are going to certainly think I have said, some negative statements, particularly about the Shia branch of Islam. And by the way, even though ISIS is Sunni, there are way more Sunnis and a smaller percentage of terrorists that come out of that than we would probably agree that out of the Shia branch, right? Smaller branch, but more terrorists. Or maybe you wouldn't agree with that.
I don't know the percentages. I probably couldn't speak to it.
Okay, no problem. Give me 3 places that people could get money, help, meet a refugee. Because that's the thing. I wish we could walk away from this and everybody have a refugee family from the Middle East over for dinner. I don't think there are. I mean, I literally do not think there are any in Kenosha, Wisconsin. It's sort of like, saying, well, blah, 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 transgender issue is really hot right now. I've never seen a transgender person, at least that I could identify, in the city of 100,000 people. And statistically, there probably isn't one. I mean, statistically, it's 0.02% of the population. So out of 100,000 people, statistically, there probably isn't one. So if we don't have somebody in our neighborhood we can invite over for dinner, how do we make this more personal? How do we try to get some kind of human connection?
Yeah. Being in Chicago, there are refugees all around me. I don't know what it's like in Kenosha, but I would say still, educate yourself. I think maybe it takes more effort for somebody in a smaller town, but if this is something that matters, and I think it matters a lot, then, maybe it'll cost us something. Maybe it means going somewhere, either to visit or in the longer term, to meet people and to make refugees our neighbors. As far as organizations, my own pitch, I worked with World Relief briefly, and they have maybe 20 offices in the States, and they do a lot of resettlement. And they have a thing called Good Neighbor Teams. So you can go to World Relief, say, I want to help out with refugees, and they will hook you up. And then also I worked with the Mennonite Central Committee. That's who I went to Lebanon with. They're based out of Pennsylvania and then up in Canada. And yeah, these are organizations that just check out. If you want to give. If you want to learn, you can just learn. But definitely wherever you are, there are people, there are NGOs, there are churches, there are mosques doing really good work with refugees, with immigrants, with displaced people. And so I don't know. I mean, again, I don't know what it's like in super small town America, but I think if you look, you'll be able to find how to help.
Well, and Kenosha is not super small town by any means. Statistically, Muslims are only 3% of the population, so you can live a lot of places and not be anywhere close to.
Sure.
The mosque in town flies the Albanian flag, and so what that means is the Muslims in Kenosha are more than likely, because there's a lot of Eastern Europeans here, they're more than likely resettled Eastern Europeans who came here for better economic opportunity, not because their country was overrun. So that does kind of get me back to, at least locally, supporting a good organization, because there's a whole bunch of other stuff that I can get involved in, but for me, within 10 miles of my house, that may not be one of them.
Yeah, that's fair.
So anything else you want us to know, where we can find your writing, just as we wrap this thing up, or how people can stay in touch with you?
Yeah, I've been freelancing for Christianity Today and the Chicago Tribune, a little bit for Relevant as well. I'd love to have you check that out. Or my blog is griffinpauljackson.com.